Tonight, we are tracking a major and potentially dangerous turn in the Russia-Ukraine war, because for the first time in this conflict, multiple European governments are openly discussing deploying troops inside Ukraine as part of what they describe as a future peace and security arrangement, while Russia is issuing an unmistakable warning. Moscow says it will not accept any Western troop presence in Ukraine under any label, including deployments connected to NATO, training missions, or stabilization forces. Here's what we know right now. On the battlefield, pressure is intensifying across Ukraine's east and south, with reports of heavier Russian strikes and expanding drone attacks. Ukrainian officials say an overnight drone strike sparked a major fire at a storage facility in Odessa, and fighting remains fierce around key frontline areas, including Pokrovsk and Siversk, where both sides continue to report combat gains and losses. Meanwhile, Moscow claims it has captured Kupiansk, a strategically important city in northeastern Ukraine. Kyiv denies that claim, and Ukrainian leadership is framing it as part of a wider information campaign, with officials emphasizing that fighting continues and that Russian statements do not match Ukraine's reported situation on the ground. While the military picture remains contested, the political pressure is unmistakably rising, especially from Washington. Former President Donald Trump has publicly repeated that the war should never have started, and he has suggested peace may require territorial concessions, with the idea that Ukraine would give up parts of the eastern Donbass region still under Ukrainian control in exchange for some form of security guarantee. President Zelensky has previously rejected surrendering territory, but the reality is that conversations about land, security guarantees, and enforcement mechanisms are now moving from private diplomacy into public debate. This is where Europe enters the story in a dramatic way. According to multiple European statements summarized in recent reporting, a group that includes the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and several other European countries is signaling readiness to lead a multinational force connected to a peace framework, described as a mission that could help secure Ukrainian airspace, strengthen maritime safety in the Black Sea, and support operations inside Ukraine as part of post-deal stabilization. European leaders are presenting this not as a plan to launch a new war, but as a way to make any ceasefire or peace agreement more durable. Essentially, a deterrent force designed to reduce the chance of another major invasion once a deal is signed. But Russia's position is blunt. Moscow says any Western troop presence in Ukraine would be unacceptable and would cross a red line, regardless of what it is called or which flags it carries. That sets up the core question. If Europe moves forward, what happens if those forces come under attack? And to what extent would the United States respond? The U.S. position has been consistent in one key respect. Washington has supported Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and aid, but it has also drawn a line against sending American troops to fight inside Ukraine. So even as European officials suggest there is American backing for a broader framework, the definition of backing matters. Does it mean political support, intelligence sharing, air defense assistance, logistics, funding, or a security guarantee that could pull the U.S. into a wider conflict if Europeans are targeted? That distinction is exactly what makes this moment so sensitive. European officials argue that any peace plan without enforcement is fragile, because without a credible deterrent, Russia could regroup and pressure Ukraine again later. Russia argues that any Western troop presence is not peacekeeping, but escalation by another name. And Ukraine, caught in the middle, is seeking guarantees strong enough to prevent a repeat of 2014 and 2022, while also trying to avoid political conditions that would look like forced surrender. Underneath all of this is the military reality. When front lines move, diplomacy changes. When casualties climb, urgency rises. And when outside powers debate placing troops near an active war zone, the risk of miscalculation grows quickly. Over the coming days, watch for three things. First, whether European governments clarify what troop deployment really means: numbers, mission scope, rules of engagement, and whether it would occur only after a signed agreement or even during negotiations. Second, whether Washington publicly defines the limits of its involvement if Europeans deploy inside Ukraine. And third, whether Moscow responds not only with warnings, but with concrete military repositioning or new conditions for any talks. The key point tonight is this: the war is no longer only about the front line. It's increasingly about the shape of a future security order in Europe, and whether a peace plan, if it emerges, would be protected by diplomacy alone or backed by forces on the ground. And that is exactly why this is such a high-stakes moment, because if Europe moves from support to deployment and Russia treats that as provocation, the next phase of this conflict could become wider, faster, and far harder to control.